In this episode, we will talk about how transformers learn regular language recognition. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into some really interesting research about how simple transformer networks learn, specifically how they handle tasks like even pairs and parity check.
Right, and these might sound a bit abstract, but they're actually super useful. They help us benchmark large language models, LLMs.
Benchmarks, how so?
Well, they act as fundamental tests. By seeing how transformers tackle these simpler, regular language problems, we get clues about the core mechanics, how they might handle more complex language later on.
Okay, makes sense. So let's break down these tasks. First up, even pairs. What exactly is that?
Generally, it's about checking if certain bits of a sequence show up an even number of times. But for the research we're digging into, they simplified it. They looked at binary sequences.
Like just A's and B's or Z's and 1s.
Exactly, and the task was just,
Yeah.
is the very first token the same as the very last token in the sequence?
Gotcha. First equals last? Simple enough. And parity check.
Parity check is also about even or odd occurrences, but it's often seen as, well, trickier. For instance, does the letter B appear an even number of times in a string of A's and B's, that kind of thing?
Right. A bit more involved than just checking the ends. So the core of this research is really looking at a one-layer transformer
Yeah, just one attention layer plus a linear layer right after it. Pretty basic setup.
and how it learns these two tasks using gradient descent, the standard training method.
Exactly. And one of the big takeaways, perhaps the most striking one, is that while this simple transformer can learn even pairs directly, no problem.
Huh?
Parity check seems to need something more. It needs this thing called chain of thought, or KISS-T.
Chain of thought, like the model reasoning step by step.
Precisely. And they found you could integrate this KISS-T either when the model is making predictions, that's inference, or you could bake it right into the training itself.
Okay, that's fascinating. So the model needs to think aloud, so to speak, for the harder task. And you mentioned a pattern they observed during training for both tasks.
Yes, a really consistent two-phase pattern. It's like the transformer has this distinct learning process it goes through.
Tell me about phase one.
Phase one is all about speed. The attention layer grows really fast, figures out how to look at the sequences in a way that makes the positive and negative examples, well, separable. It learns what features matter.
So it's rapidly finding the important bits of the input.
You got it. Figuring out where to focus its attention for that specific task.
And then phase two, what happens there?
Phase two is different. The attention layer kind of settles down. It stabilizes.
Doesn't change much anymore.
Right. The big action shifts to the linear layer. That final layer starts growing, but more slowly. Logarithmically, actually. And it's pushing towards what's called a max margin hyperplane.
Okay, max margin hyperplane. Sounds technical. What's the intuition there?
Think of it as finding the best possible dividing line. The one that separates the yes examples from the no examples with the biggest possible gap, the most confidence.
Ah, okay. So phase one finds the features. Phase two draws a really clear boundary based on those features.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, thinking about where this research fits, apparently even pairs hasn't been theoretically studied like this before.
That's right. Which is surprising given how fundamental it seems. So this analysis is quite novel in that respect.
And for parity check, others have looked at it, but this study is different.
Yeah, previous work maybe looked at parts in isolation or just the very beginning of training. This research aims for a more complete picture. It looks at the joint training, how attention and the linear layer learn together. It analyzes convergent speed, the implicit biases, what solutions the model prefers.
Right. It's not just one piece, but how the whole simple system learns. And it's important to remember these aren't like standard image classification tasks, are they?
Not at all. With images, you often have clear visual features. This shape means cat, that texture means dog. Here, the classification isn't about obvious local features. For even pairs or parity, the transformer has to use attention to find these more complex relationships, dependencies across the whole sequence.
It really needs that attention mechanism to work hard.
Absolutely. So the overall approach was to really track how the model changes during gradient descent training, how its parameters get implicitly biased towards finding the right answer.
And focusing on both layers learning together, which, as you said, isn't always done in theoretical work.
Exactly. That joint analysis is a key part of this.
Okay, let's dive deeper into even pairs. Remind us again the specific version here.
First token equals the last token in a binary sequence of length L.
Right. And what makes analyzing this tricky, you mentioned the joint training.
Yes, that's the big one. The linear layer's updates depend on the attention layer, And the attention layer's updates depend on the linear layer. It's this coupled process.
Like two gears turning each other.
Kind of, yeah. Analyzing that interplay is mathematically challenging.
And there was another issue. Something about gradients.
Gradient cancellation. Yeah. Because, see, every token appears in both positive examples first last and negative examples first last. So the updates pushing the parameters one way can sometimes get canceled out by updates pushing them another way. It muddies the waters a bit during analysis.
Okay, complex coupling and potentially canceling signals. How did they get around that analytically?
They used higher order Taylor expansions.
Uh-oh, math alert. Keep it simple for us.
Okay. Basically, a Taylor expansion lets you approximate a complicated function with simpler bits. Higher order just means a better, more detailed approximation. It let them get a finer-grained look at how the gradients for both layers were interacting and influencing the parameter updates, despite the complexity, like using a stronger microscope.
Got it. A better approximation tool. So let's talk phase one for even pairs. Rapid feature alignment.
Right. So in this phase, the layers sort of help each other out. Attention learns to find relevant features like info about the first and last tokens. And the linear layer starts aligning itself to those features, getting better at telling positive from negative samples.
And they introduced this idea of a token score.
Yeah, the token score is basically how much the linear layer values or aligns with the embedding of a specific token at a certain position. Higher score means more importance, roughly speaking.
Okay. And Theorem 4.1 describes what happens here. What are the key takeaways?
Well, one big thing is that the score for the first token shoots up really fast.
Why the first one specifically?
The thinking is it's because of short sequences early in training. Length 1 sequences, for instance. They always have first last, so they're always positive. This gives the first token an early advantage, a strong signal.
Ah, the model finds an easy pattern early on. What else?
The theorem also shows attention changes. For positive samples, first last, attention on the first token increases. Makes sense.
And for negative samples?
It gets suppressed. The model learns not to rely solely on the first token when the ends are different. It needs to look elsewhere.
Interesting. So it learns what not to focus on too. What about other tokens, like the second or third?
Their scores tend to decrease in phase 1. Especially the second token's score drops quite fast.
Why the second?
Probably because it appears frequently in both positive and negative samples, without a clear correlation to the label. So its overall importance gets down-weighted quickly. And this decrease actually pushes the attention mechanism in negative samples to pay more attention to that second token, perhaps as another way to help distinguish those negative cases.
Wow. Okay. So by the end of phase one, attention has learned some quite nuanced strategies for weighing tokens differently depending on the situation. But the linear layer isn't perfect yet.
Exactly. The features are getting aligned, the separation is starting, but it's not necessarily a clean cut yet. That's what phase 2 is for.
Phase two, margin maximization and implicit bias. So the focus shifts.
Totally. Now it's less about finding the features and more about making the separation between positive and negative examples as clean and wide as possible. And this is driven by the implicit bias of gradient descent. Even without explicitly telling it to, GD often favors solutions with a good safety margin.
It wants to be confident in its answers.
Precisely. And Theorem 4.4 describes this phase. What does it tell us?
Okay, key insights from that theorem.
First, the overall size, or norm, of the linear layer keeps growing, but slower now, logarithmically. This growth is what actually widens that classification margin.
Making the separation more robust. And the attention layer, does it keep evolving?
Much less so. The theorem shows that changes to the attention layer in phase 2 are negligible, bounded. The patterns learned in phase 1 basically stick. The models found how to look at the sequence. Now the linear layer just refines this decision based on that view.
So attention sets the stage, linear layer draws the final clear line, and it converges to this max margin solution.
Yes. The linear layer is now in a regime governed by that implicit bias, heading towards the optimal hyperplane that separates the attention outputs with the largest possible margin. It's a known phenomenon, but cool to see it characterized here.
Okay, so summing up even pairs. Attention learns to check if first and last tokens match. Linear layer then maximizes the margin for that decision.
That's the essence of it.
Right. Now onto the harder one, parity check. Like counting bees. You said a single pass of a one-layer transformer can't solve this.
Correct. The research confirms that. It's too complex for that simple setup applied just once.
So they needed chain of thought. What was the first approach they tried with COT?
Approach 1 involved using truncated COT. But here's the kicker. They used it at inference time, with a transformer that was only ever trained on even pairs.
Wait, what? How can an even pairs model do parity checking without retraining? That sounds surprising.
It is surprising. The insight comes from thinking about finite automata, simple machines that track state. To track parity, even out of Ds, an automaton transitions state based on the next token. It essentially compares its current state, even odd, with the input token.
Okay.
The researchers realized this comparison step is related to what the even pairs model learned, comparing two things, first and last tokens.
A connection between comparing states tokens and comparing first-last tokens. Clever.
Yeah, very. So they set up an iterative process. Take your input sequence, say AB. Step 1, use the even pairs model. Are A first and B last the same? Model says no, predicts, say, B for unequal. Now, you append this B prediction, making AB, and remove the first token, leaving AB.
Okay, sequence changes based on the prediction.
Step 2, repeat, input B, are first B and last B the same? Model says yes, predicts A for equal. Append A, remove first B, leaves B. You keep doing this L1 times.
L being the original length.
Right. And the very final prediction tells you the parity of the original sequence. They essentially map equal, unequal from the even pairs task to even odd parity.
That is genuinely remarkable. Zero-shot parity checking using an even pairs model just by structuring the inference this way. It suggests the model learns something quite fundamental about comparison.
Absolutely. It points towards a kind of modularity in what these models learn.
Okay, that was approach 1. What was the second approach? Training with Comini.
Yes. Approach 2 involved training directly for parity check, using full chain of thought with a technique called teacher forcing.
Full CoT. How does that differ from the truncated version during training?
Instead of just iterating at inference, here, during training, you keep the original sequence and you append the correct intermediate reasoning step, the parity state, after each token. The model learns the whole step-by-step process explicitly.
So it's learning to simulate the automaton, generating the intermediate even or odd states itself.
Exactly. For AB, it would learn to predict parity after A, then after AB, then after AB. And teacher forcing means you provide the correct intermediate parity label at each step as guidance during training.
You show it the correct reasoning path.
Precisely. The training data is set up so each step effectively trains the model to compare the latest token with the implied current parity state.
Sounds complex to train. Any issues?
Yep. Vanishing gradients became a problem when they tried training only with this CoT loss. The error signals get too weak over the longer reasoning chains. Common issue.
Right. So how did they fix the vanishing gradients?
Really smart workaround. They used the even pairs loss as a regularizer.
A regularizer, meaning?
They added shorter sequences, labeled for the even pairs task, into the training mix along with the longer CoT sequences. The idea is that learning the simpler even pairs task first helps stabilize the linear layer, giving it a good starting point to then learn the more complex CoT reasoning for parity check, kind of like pre-training or data mixing.
So give it a foundation with even pairs to help it tackle the harder CoT learning.
You've got it. So the total loss was a mix of the CoT loss and this even pairs regularization loss.
And still trained with gradient descent.
Still gradient descent. And guess what?
Let me guess. 2 phases again?
Bingo. This CoT training also showed the same two-phase dynamic.
Okay, so phase 1 in this CoT setup. Similar linear layer dynamics because of the regularization.
Yeah, the linear layer behaves similarly to the pure even pairs training initially, thanks to that regularization. The difference is more in the attention dynamics on the longer CoT sequences. Theorem 5.1 suggests attention learns to focus differently, particularly highlighting a token around position L0 plus 1, which seems crucial for tracking the parity state during the CoT process.
And by the end of this phase 1, the model can do the parity check, including the intermediate steps.
Yes, the analysis shows the attention outputs become separable for all CoT steps. A linear classifier could correctly label the whole reasoning chain. And interestingly, that same classifier also worked for the even pairs task on the shorter sequences used for regularization.
Very efficient.
Yeah.
And phase 2 for CoT margin maximization again.
You guessed it. Similar story. Theorem 5.2 shows attention stabilizes, and the linear layer keeps growing logarithmically, converging towards the max margin solution. But this time, it's the max margin solution for separating all the steps in the chain of thought process.
So that 2-phase dynamic attention learns features, linear layer maximizes margin, seems really fundamental here, whether it's direct learning or CoT-based.
It really does appear to be a core learning pattern for this setup.
Did they run experiments to back this all up?
They did, on synthetic data, carefully controlling parameters like sequence length, learning rate, regularization strength.
And the results match the theory.
Yep, they included figures showing the loss dropping, the token scores evolving, just as Theorem 4.1 predicted for even pairs, attention weights changing as expected. Crucially, the plots clearly show the two phases rapid initial changes, then that logarithmic growth of the linear layer norm kicking in for phase 2.
And similar validation for the parity check experiments.
Absolutely. Similar plots confirm the token score and attention dynamics predicted by their theory for the CODE-SE setup, again clearly showing the two phases. They even showed results with different regularization strengths in the appendix, all supporting the two-phase observation.
Great to see theory and experiment align so well. Okay, let's wrap this up. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, the big one is the theoretical characterization of these two training phases for one-layer transformers learning these regular languages. They showed how higher-order Taylor expansions can be a powerful tool for analyzing the tricky joint training of attention and linear layers.
Giving us real insights into the training dynamics.
Exactly, and it highlights how crucial chain of thought is for tackling problems like parity check that go beyond simple first-last comparisons.
And the experiments confirmed it all.
Right. The validation supports the theory on how parameters evolve and converge. The researchers suggest these analysis tools could be really useful for studying implicit bias and training in transformers on other structured tasks too.
A really solid piece of work clarifying these fundamental learning processes. It's amazing how much complexity is there, even in a simple one-layer model.
It really is, and it definitely leaves us with something to chew on.
A final provocative thought for our listeners.
Indeed. How might these findings, about these simple transformers scale up? How do they inform our understanding of the huge complex models we use every day? Could this two-phase learning find features that maximize margin be a general principle for how neural nets learn abstractions?
And what about that link between even pairs and parity check?
Right. What does that connection imply for things like transfer learning or multitask learning in big LLMs? Can models repurpose basic learned operations in sophisticated ways we don't fully grasp yet? Lots to think about.